I'm Neel. This is Billy. Billy, do you want to explain the caveats?
Hey, folks. Yeah, so I'm Billy Leonard from Google. We're both on our threat analysis group. So we're going to talk a bit about Sandworm today. A couple caveats before we kind of dive in. So we all have different data points. We all have different views into data. Google has one view, Microsoft has another view, CrowdStrike has a view, FireEye has a view. We also all are kind of special snowflakes, so we all have our own names for these different groups. Some of us are bigger snowflakes than others. So to kind of like set the stage, so Sandworm is a group that we'll be talking about. Our internal name for that is Frozen Barents. It varies slightly from how FireEye or iSight classifies Sandworm. Also, if you hear us mention Frozen Lake, that's our internal name for APT28. So just kind of like set the stage a bit. We generally consider Sandworm to all be the same thing. We all have a little bit of different views of that. So kind of to get things started, our story on Sandworm, when we sort of like started really diving into this evolution of the group, was around the 2017 French presidential elections. And so the activity as it relates to Russia targeting the French presidential election in 2017 is pretty well covered. The APT28 was featured prominently in this. We started seeing APT28 activity targeting the French elections around March 10th. And this was primarily credential phishing related, almost all credential phishing related, targeting both personal as well as like campaign or professional accounts, with you, if you will, on that campaign. We see that activity continue through March into early April. Around April 13th, we see this new group of activity that starts targeting the French presidential elections. In the morning, we see these same actors. They're targeting interest as it relates to Syria. It's almost like they went to lunch. After they came back from lunch, they got this new sort of tasking, and we see them start targeting from the same set of accounts, start targeting individuals associated with the French presidential campaign. And we see that in that group of activity is what we'll call Sandworm today. That was on a Thursday. On Friday, April 14th, is the last day that we see APT28 targeting the French presidential campaign, targeting Macron. They're both on the personal and professional side. So it's almost like the B team was told to take their ball and go home, and they called up the A team to kind of see through the end of the mission. So we see Sandworm activity targeting the elections, Macron, et cetera, all the way through May 5th. May 5th is the day that we see kind of this coordinated effort to leak victim content, not just from APT28, but also from Sandworm. And that both gets leaked in one leak, posted Pastebin, 4chan, a number of other sites. And that all sort of happens on the same day at the same time. It's a bit hard to see, I'm sorry. So kind of showing the distinction here. On the left is APT28 infrastructure accounts, IPs, domains, etc. On the right is the Sandworm activity. And this is only exclusive to targeting the campaign, but as you can see, it's very distinct. The infrastructure, the accounts, everything involved with it, two very distinct operations.
And there was malware involved as well. So these are screenshots of some of the lure documents that they sent about campaign financing. And these sort of make sense in the elections context. Some of them were sort of topical at the time. One that I didn't expect was guidelines for journalists to avoid cyber attacks. They tried a few different things and they were successful. Also, they were one of the earliest testers, adopters of CV 2017-0199, which was a Office vulnerability that basically allowed you to include and run remote code. No memory corruption, it just worked. And so this kind of took off like wildfire around this time as well, and they were some of the earliest testers of that. This is a screenshot of the Pastebin leak. So the content stolen by these two distinct groups converged and was leaked in a coordinated fashion hours before election silence on May the 5th. And so as of, I think, midnight, the campaigns were no longer able to respond or talk about anything publicly. And so within minutes, less than an hour of the election silence kicking in, the campaign, Macron's campaign comes out and mentions tainted leaks and fake documents. And I think that took a lot of the wind out of these leaks. And so in a way, this was an experiment, not just in handoff between these groups, but also in terms of the timing of the leaks. And we talked about macro documents and how they're, this is not incredibly sophisticated stuff. And I think this is an intentional strategy here. So you don't necessarily throw your most advanced tooling into an email and send it directly to targets. So, and I think what you're seeing here, this headline is sort of a testament to the success of the strategy here. So the director of ANSI said that the attack was so generic and simple that it could have been anyone, practically anyone. And I think us in the threat intel community, we tend to focus on sophisticated attacks, and it sort of leads to this perception that all targeted attacks must be sophisticated, and conversely, anything sophisticated must also be targeted. And that's obviously not the case.
So kind of moving through the summer and fall of 2017, Andy talked a bit about some of the activity that we have seen in 2017 as far as it relates to NotPetya and stuff. So moving into late fall, early winter of 2017, we see this group kind of pivot to targeting South Korea, a number of organizations as they relate to the Winter Olympics. Yeah, so this activity, it's been really well covered in the press. A bunch of folks did a lot of really good work on it. This is a screenshot from a Kaspersky report that kind of goes through the outline of how they targeted the managed service provider. They pivoted from compromising the managed service provider into the Olympics network and kind of did their thing. BK would probably be upset if I didn't mention that this is not APT10, even though they compromised the managed service provider. So we see them at the same time, they also deploy their wiper malware.
How many of you know what a rich PE header is? A couple. Yeah, I think I probably stared at PE files for 15 years before I figured out what's that little rich thing there. So it's compiler metadata added by Microsoft's compilers at compile and link time. It gives you information about the version of the compiler and the linker, how many times it was invoked, and so on. And so this was called out by Kaspersky and some really good research that pointed to this being a false flag. And what they found was that by looking at the code, they could tell a little bit about the higher level language and how it was built, and that did not match the compiler metadata that was attached to the file. And in addition to that, compiler metadata was taken wholesale from a piece of North Korean malware. And so, you combine those two things, and you see that this was obviously an attempt at forging or trying to misdirect attribution. But some really good research there.
So yeah, so despite all this public reporting, there's been something that's kind of been missing from like the public view as it relates to Sandworm and their activity in South Korea in the Winter Olympics. And during this time, there's been this little like robot android that's been kind of lurking in the background. This is not the original veteran of cyber war, Wes Shields, but there was a bit of android activity that we were able to find from this group starting in November of 2017. So what we saw them do was they took a number of legitimate apps that were popular in South Korea. So for example, this is like a bus timetable app that they would download from the Play Store, the legitimate version. They would backdoor that, and then they would re-upload that to the Play Store under their own developer account. So they did this with a number of different apps, all with a South Korean theme, So this is like a PDF reader, a financial one, this secure mail thing that they also were messing with. So this was all kind of happening in November and December of 2017.
And I love IDA screenshots, so here's one for all of those that you do as well. But I think we have a tenant, so we don't exactly know, and I'll talk about the design of this malware, but we don't exactly know what the intent was behind it. It was modular, it was a wrapper around an existing application, so there's a bit of native code that decrypted the backdoor and dropped it to disk. Why you would encrypt your backdoor and then just drop it to disk, I don't know. And then if we can go to the next slide. It was also sort of well designed to address the challenges of collecting data from mobile devices. So you think about a phone, as it moves through networks, you have varying levels of connectivity, metered, unmetered. Whether or not it's charging might determine sort of how much data you could steal from the device and how quickly you could exfiltrate it. But also this piece of malware was modular, so and again by design we can't necessarily tell all of the use cases that were intended here because one of the things it did was pull down modules from its command and control server and then run it. But it would fingerprint devices. It had a local queue in SQLite of data that it would want to eventually exfiltrate. So it would bind tasks to Wi-Fi connectivity, and so when an affected device was not connected to Wi-Fi, it would queue that data in order to exfiltrate it later. So it would also sort of fingerprint the devices and collect the sort of data you'd expect from a mobile backdoor. So this is a disassembly of their DEX loading code that was used to load modules. So we have some very good tooling, I think some of the best in the private sector in terms of disassembling and then comparing code at scale. And so, I sort of criticize people that sort of dive very deep into the details, but here I am doing that right in front of you. And I'll sort of call it one more piece of disassembly here on the next slide. So was a minimal amount of shared code that was 100% similar between this and Hacking Team's Android implants. So you're talking about a piece of malware that was, over 10,000 functions in total. And we're talking like 1 or 2 functions here. And so we look at prevalence, and then we look at where that piece of code occurred. And this piece of code here is to serialize XML, and it, in the way that it was used and the way it was built. This is only found in these 2 places. I don't know what it means. It's not, some of you may recall that Hacking Team was compromised and had a whole bunch of their source code leaked in 2015. And so this, as far as I can tell, is not code that was included in that leak. It does predate that leak as well. But beyond that, I'm not sure what exactly is going on here. And it may actually be nothing, but I'll just sort of highlight it because there's other people out there who will do this exact same analysis and notice it. And here's an example, or here's the hard-coded config from one of these pieces of malware. You can see in the top right-hand corner there's an IP address and a URI that it reached out to pull down modules to exfiltrate data. And when we dug into this, we found that on the next slide, it was a Tor node, the C2 IP. And then, so we saw this Olympic activity, these Olympic-themed apps, and then we went to look at what else might have been out there. And it's never really a good feeling when you're now analyzing a piece of malware and you go to research it and you find a blog post about it. It didn't say malware, but it did talk about a fake UKR.net app. And so at the time we caught this, it was relatively early. But so there was on the order of a few hundred devices infected in total by this. And this is not the last time we'd see this piece of malware, so just keep that in mind. We're going to come back to this in a little bit.
Yeah, so rolling off of the Olympics, the last sort of activity that we see from this group targeting South Korea was around March, like mid-March, which is a bit odd because the Olympics ended in February. But so moving into kind of spring of 2018, we see Sandworms start with some of this domestic targeting of companies that are internal to Russia, they're Russia-based, and they kind of fall into these 3 broad categories. The first being like commercial real estate, so this is companies that are building like big condo buildings, apartment buildings, that are leasing these, stuff like this, as well as a number of different financial institutions that are doing mortgages and loans and car loans, stuff like this, and the third being the automotive industry. So this is folks that are selling cars in Russia, they're importing cars, servicing cars, stuff like this. So this is definitely a shift from, you see this group going, they're targeting Winter Olympics, trying to do destructive attacks against the Olympics, to targeting domestic companies within Russia. So it's a fairly large shift. Going through the summer of 2018, coming into the fall of 2018, we start seeing what we'll call these software supply chain attacks, where we see Sandworm targeting software developers, mobile application developers, app developers, primarily based in the Ukraine. So this starts October, runs into November, December timeframe of targeting these app developers. They use a number of different lures. We'll go through a couple of them here, of where they're asking for help on how to get the app to run. They're asking for help from the developers on how they can get their own apps to run. They're trying to file basically like bug reports with these developers saying, hey, your app doesn't work, what can I do? We also see them with like the typical resume.zip type stuff, which we see across the board from multiple different groups. And then also kind of maybe the most interesting one was where they'll contact an app developer and they'll basically say, hey, you stole my work. And then begin threatening them with, hey, if you don't take your icons or your software or whatever down, then I'm going to threaten you with legal action, etc. And it kind of followed the normal chain of a document within a zip file that had macros that led to PowerShell Empire, another fairly like common open source or otherwise freely available first stage tool. So this is one of those lures that they were using. The language in this, I'm told, is very good. Google Translate does okay with it. This is basically them, they're contacting an app developer, they're saying, hey, you're using icons that I developed, my friend told me about it, if you don't take your app down, then I'm going to sue you, I'm going to do whatever. They go through this whole process, and then, hey, if this sounds good to you, I'm going to send you a document that will kind of lay out what I'm indicating here. If you can just open that for me, that would be great. So this is when kind of doc with macro stuff kicks off.
So if a developer were to open one of these documents, this is what they'd be presented with until they allowed macros to run. So this is an Office document, but they have this splash screen here. And then the macros that would actually run look like this. And I guess the thing I want to highlight here is that they've been through some form of obfuscation. So the syntax is important, but the actual characters and the tokens here and the names, the functions and variables are not. And so those have been substituted. And so you have functions like load cactus or gorgeous father, which are obviously nonsense, but they were originally something else. And so they've been obfuscated and replaced. And so they eventually do succeed at compromising an application developer. And once they had compromised this application developer, they log into their Play Store account, go to the Play Store, and attempt to upload a new version of one of their apps. So this developer had several apps. The app that they attempted to backdoor here and uploaded a backdoored version of was a app about Ukraine history. And so what ended up happening is that due to our analysis of the previous campaigns around the Olympics, and sort of looking back at the previous UKR.net campaign as well, this upload was flagged at publication time, at upload time, and so go to the next slide. Oh, I've got a slide here about sort of what they did to backdoor the app. So this is actually different than the previous versions where they had a wrapper around a pre-existing app. So they actually took the DEX file from this app. I don't think they built from source, but they modified the DEX file to insert a method and then a little bit of code into the original launchable activity. And so in red, you can see that they added a call to the launchable activity and then some code, another method that starts a new thread that sort of bootstraps their implant along the side of this app. And so there's some evidence that they tamper with the DEX file itself, some ordering of the different elements in the DEX file that sort of hint at that. But what ended up happening was, as a result of our study of the previous instances of this malware, we caught this at upload time. So in this case, our protections worked as intended, and there were no devices infected by this. And so this is sort of what we go for when we study these threats and sort of try and dig deep on them.
Yeah, so moving into fall of 2018 again, into running basically to the present. So working with some friends, we started seeing these kind of interesting looking subdomains on a wide variety of second level domains. These all kind of look like, if you look at them, hey, these are going to be cred phishing domains. Maybe we can go look for these in email, find them somewhere. On its own, normal like cred phishing domains, not particularly exciting. What kind of made these stick out is that they were resolving to IPs that had previously hosted PowerShell Empire servers or other post-exploitation tools. So it kind of like caused you to look at it, dig into it a little bit deeper. These domains, we weren't seeing these get sent in email, which is how you usually get your targets to click on your links, end up on your cred phishing sites. We'll talk a bit about how we ended up seeing these being used in the wild. A Facebook phishing page, guess what? It looks like a Facebook phishing page. Similarly with UKR and a couple of Bulgarian sites, the phishing sites look like phishing sites. But what we ended up learning was that they weren't sending links to these domains to get targets to click on them. What they were doing is they were compromising legitimate sites, and then instead of serving exploits or malware from these sites, they were redirecting users so that they could then do credential phishing against them, which is not something you typically see or that we typically see. And the sites, they have a fairly large number of sites that they've compromised, somewhere around 25 or so. And they kind of fall into 5 buckets. The first being kind of religious organization sites that we've seen them compromise, very heavy on the Orthodox Church, Eastern Orthodox Church. The second being like government sites. These are Ukrainian government sites that as they host information on Ukrainian politicians, things like this. The third being news, media, online newspapers, journalist sites, stuff like this. The fourth being some sports-related sites, especially on like Ukrainian soccer, Ukrainian football. And then the fifth being a number of financial-related sites, so going back to like mortgage lenders, car loans, stuff like this. So we're going through this sort of activity, looking at these credential phishing, what we'll call water holes right now. And there's sort of this one domain that's sort of stuck out, which I didn't really recognize, so Moogle. So if you remember back to Andy's book, he has a section on there where my friend Drew, he immediately recognizes the campaign code that they use in one of their old Black Energy samples is a reference to Dune. Unfortunately, I do not have an encyclopedic knowledge of science fiction like Drew does, so I had to look up what this Moogle was. It turns out it's this character from Final Fantasy. So it's like they grew up from Dune, they stopped reading Dune, they started playing Final Fantasy at some point. So we'll kind of end with several different campaigns that we've seen throughout 2019. Some of these, we'll say spring and summer time frame. The first being a number of campaigns that are targeting charities, charitable organizations. Kind of one that stuck out was a charity that supports orphanages in Ukraine. And then a second set of campaigns was targeting local, regional government offices within Russia. So this is kind of like timeline of activity. Across the top, you can see the dates, and then down the side is sort of targets that we've seen and when we've seen those organizations targeted. A few that we'll specifically call out. If you read Andy's book, Ukraine heavily featured in there. They've also been heavily featured in our work. We've seen them targeted pretty much for as long as we've been tracking this group. Another one, kind of the Orthodox Church, we briefly mentioned that. And then as well as say, like Syria was big for a while. It's kind of died down a little bit. Orthodox Church. We see a fair bit of targeting of, say, like the political opposition in Russia, as in people that are not pro-Putin. Anything else we want to call them?
Yeah, I guess more recently, MSPs and data centers are in there. There was some targeting around the time of the Skripal investigation of organizations that investigate chemical weapons as well. But it's pretty, when you see it all laid out like that, you kind of see the big picture.
So yeah, to kind of wrap things up, this group, very agile, their taskings change all the time. It's a very wide variety of taskings as well. A number of groups that you track, you'll see them target the same folks over and over again. This group, they'll target someone for a week and you won't see them target that group again, or they'll come back to them 6 months from now. We see a lot of their typical, like traditional, we'll consider espionage targeting. Destructive attacks and stuff go along with that, but then we also see the domestic targeting from this group. Heavy use of like customized, slightly customized open source tools, so like their own modifications of PowerShell Empire or malicious macro generator tools like this. We only see them dropping custom tools when it actually matters, when it actually benefits them. And then something that's always important to keep in mind, like we think we have a great view on the world. Not everything makes it in the public. We don't know everything, but we do what we can. So a bunch of people to thank. First, Andy for telling this story. Our friends, Microsoft, Facebook, Yahoo, helped make all this possible. A couple individuals in particular, Mike Weaver, Mike Matonis, John Heiselmoyer, Wookie. Without this, we wouldn't be able to do this. And also our friends back in TAG. So, thanks. Any questions? I think we have time.
Hi, thanks. Really great talk, guys. I was just wondering, one of the things that I do some work tracking Russia-centric stuff a lot, PowerShell Empire being a big part of that. I was wondering if there's anything more you could share about specific modifications you observed this particular subset of activity doing when they modified PowerShell Empire. Thanks.
So this thing is like they have their own keys that they put in there. But beyond that, we also see them, they've made a few modifications. There's a version of PowerShell Empire that will run on like OS X and Linux. They made a few modifications to that as well. And then we see them dropping that in the same ways that they drop the Windows versions.
Yeah, hi there. It's Rafael Satter with Reuters. I saw you guys briefly flashed an AP story that I actually worked on. It was the interview with Guillaume Poupard that we done shortly after that. I was wondering, if there's anything more to say on this idea of, kind of like, well, just because it's not sophisticated, that doesn't mean that it's a sophisticated actor.
Yeah, I think that we tend to overly focus on the sophistication of things, and whereas these threat actors are focused on a mission, on achieving their goals. So if one of their goals is to not be attributed or to make attribution hard, this makes a lot of sense. And most of the attacks that we see are credential phishing, and there's nothing technically sophisticated about it, and it works, and that's why they do it.
I think many people here will have seen your peering into the aquarium report from 2014. So when did you first see the two different groups within this larger organization use different infrastructure and become sort of two different sets?
Sure. So specifically speaking of 28 and Sandworm, so we've always tracked them differently and tracked them separately, going back to like some of the early work on probably Black Energy was when we first kind of started tracking what we'll call Sandworm today. So that goes back to, I think, also 2014. When we wrote the aquarium report, we didn't really see, I don't know if we necessarily had any tracking of this group at the time.
Yeah, no, we hadn't followed it. Maybe we'd seen fractions or pieces of it here and there. I remember seeing some fawn exploits that we were tracking from a different group that were repurposed by them. But yeah, they weren't really as present in our consciousness as APT28 was.